Now, how do we add our own API routes to a Next.js application though? For this, I got a brand new Next.js project for you. You'll find it attached to this lecture. You can extract it, run npm install, and then once you did that, npm run dev to start it. But this application will now not be about our pages, at least not the standard pages. Indeed, there only is one page in that starting project, and that's a dummy homepage, which just says the homepage. Now, of course, we can visit this page through localhost 3000, but again, this course module will not be about creating pages like this. Instead, it is about this API routes feature, which is a feature built into Next.js. We can add our own API endpoints to Next.js by simply creating a new subfolder inside of Pages. So inside of this Pages directory, we create a subfolder, and that subfolder has to be called API. Now, up to this point, those file and folder names were mostly up to you. This is now not up to you. This has to be called API, because that's a special folder which will be recognized by Next.js. And any pages, if you want to call them like this, which you set up inside of that API folder will be treated in a special way. So let's add a page inside of the API folder. In there, you can add pages just as you can add them anywhere else in the pages folder. So you can pick names of your choice, index.js to handle requests which are just directed at /API, or to get started here, feedback.js. Let's name it feedback.js. So now I have that feedback.js file in the API folder in the pages folder. Now that will create a special path we can send requests to. It will allow us to send requests to our domain. So during development, that's localhost 3000 /API/feedback. This is what this will enable us to do. And that should make sense because we're in the API folder, in the pages folder, and we have a feedback.js file. Nonetheless, I mentioned that files and folders inside of API, so inside of this API folder, would be treated in a special way. And they will. Inside of any file inside of the API folder, like this feedback.js file, we don't export a React component. So in the other page files, we do create a React component and export that as a default. We don't do that in API routes. Instead here, we create a function which we typically should name handler because it will handle incoming requests, and a function which will get two parameters, a request object, which we could name rec, and a response object, which we could name res. And it's this function which we should export as a default here. Now that will not be a React component. This is a standard JavaScript function. Now because this file is in the API folder, Next.js will kind of take this function here to execute it for incoming requests sent to /API/feedback. And the interesting thing is that now inside of this function, we can not just handle GET requests, and we don't have to send back HTML code. Instead, this allows us to execute any server-side code of our choice. And that's important, server-side code. Any code we write in here will never end up in any client-side code bundle. So any code we write here will never be exposed to visitors of our web page. Just as code written in getStaticProps and getServerSideProps would never be exposed to our visitors. It's the same here for these API routes and the code related to them. So here in Handler, for a basic start, we could start sending back a response. And we do that with help of that response object. Now, if you have some Node.js or Express.js experience, this will look very familiar to you. And indeed here we will write Node.js code enhanced by the Next.js team to look a bit like Express.js. For example, we can send back a response with help of that response object here. And on that object, we can call special methods that allow us to send back that response and to configure that response. For example, the status method allows us to set a status code. And that could be 200 for the start to set a success status code. Then on that method, we can chain another method. So call a method on the result of this first method call. And that could be the JSON method to send back some JSON data as part of the response for incoming requests. And that is quite standard. As I mentioned before, for APIs, you typically exchange data in that JSON format because it's a highly machine readable and also human readable data format, which is the de facto standard for exchanging data with APIs. Now to the JSON method, we pass a JavaScript value like an object that will then be transformed into JSON automatically. And here we could have a message property. This is up to you though. This entire object is up to you. You can put any data you want in there. And the message could be "this works," like this. So by adding this line of code in that handler method, which is exported as a default, this will be executed by Next.js when we send a request to /API/feedback. And this code will then send back a response. Clearly not a page, clearly not a HTML response, but instead some JSON data. Because this response is not intended to be consumed by entering this in the browser. We will enter this URL in the browser for now to start working with API routes, but that is not how we will then use them on a real page. It's really just to get started. So if we save this feedback.js file now, and I then send a request to /API/feedback, we see our JSON response here. And if we open up the network tab in the DevTools and we reload to take a closer look at that response, we see the response data there as well. And in the headers, where we see some metadata about that request and response, we also see that in the response headers, the content type was set to application JSON. So this is now a special kind of page because we created that file in the special folder, and that code now allows us to run our own server-side code and to add our own application-focused API to our overall website, and that allows us to add features like newsletter sign up, user feedback submission, maybe comment submission, or anything else you need. And to really be able to add such features, let's now dig a bit deeper and explore how these API routes can be used.